The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of what I thought was my home. The sound echoed through the empty dining room where I sat alone, staring at a birthday cake meant for 20 people. 20 people who never showed up. 20 people who were supposed to be my family and closest friends. Instead, they were all at Maya's surprise engagement party, using my credit cards to fund their celebration, while I waited like a fool for guests who would never come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and until 3 days ago, I believed I was the luckiest woman in Chicago. I had what everyone thought was the perfect life: a successful marketing career, a beautiful downtown apartment, and what I believed was an unshakable circle of friends and family who loved me unconditionally. I was 28 years old, financially stable, and genuinely happy with the direction my life was taking. Or at least I thought I was. The morning of my birthday started like any other Tuesday in October. I woke up early, made my usual green tea, and checked my phone expecting the flood of birthday messages that had become routine over the years. Instead, I found 3 generic texts and a missed call from my mother. The silence felt strange, but I convinced myself everyone was just busy. After all, we had plans for dinner that evening at Luminous, the upscale restaurant I'd reserved weeks in advance for my birthday celebration. I'd spent considerable time organizing this dinner, wanting everything to be perfect. The guest list included my younger sister Maya, my college roommate Jessica, my co-worker and close friend Amanda, my cousin David, and several other people I considered family. These weren't just casual acquaintances. These were the people who had been in my life for years, who knew my dreams, my fears, and my deepest secrets. I trusted them completely, which makes what happened next so much more devastating. The day dragged on at work with unusual quietness from my colleagues. I kept checking my phone, expecting the usual birthday chaos of calls, texts, and social media notifications. Instead, there was an eerie silence that made my stomach twist with unease. When 5 o'clock arrived, I practically raced home to get ready for dinner, convincing myself that everyone was planning some kind of surprise that would explain the strange behavior. I spent 2 hours getting ready, choosing my favorite black dress and the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me. I wanted to look perfect for what I hoped would be a memorable evening. I even stopped by the bakery on my way to the restaurant to pick up the custom cake I'd ordered. A beautiful chocolate creation with intricate sugar flowers that had cost me nearly $200. It seemed excessive at the time, but I wanted this birthday to be special. Luminous was exactly as elegant as I remembered from my previous visits. The hostess led me to the private dining room I'd reserved, and I arranged the cake on the side table while waiting for my guests to arrive. 7 o'clock came and went. Then 7:30. By 8 o'clock, I was calling Maya, my sister, who had always been the most reliable person in my life. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I tried Jessica next, then Amanda, then David. Every single call went unanswered. The hostess kept glancing at me with increasingly sympathetic looks, and I could feel the pitying stares from other diners who could see into our glass-walled private room. I was sitting alone at a table set for 20 people, with a birthday cake that seemed to mock me with its cheerful appearance. At 8:30, I finally received a text from Maya that would change everything I thought I knew about my life. The message was brief and cold, so unlike her usual warm communication style. It simply said, "Sorry, can't make it tonight. Something came up. Happy birthday." No explanation, no apology beyond those perfunctory words, no suggestion to reschedule. Just complete dismissal of what was supposed to be an important day for me. The other responses trickled in over the next hour, each one more devastating than the last. Jessica claimed she had food poisoning but was posting Instagram stories from what appeared to be a high-end restaurant. Amanda said she had a family emergency, but was tagged in Facebook photos at what looked like a party. David didn't respond at all. One by one, every person I had counted on let me know they wouldn't be coming, and their excuses were either obviously false or insultingly brief. I sat in that private dining room until 9:30, long past the point where it became clear that no one was coming. The waitstaff was kind, but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I ordered a glass of wine and a small appetizer, more to justify taking up the space than because I had any appetite. The birthday cake sat untouched on its side table, a monument to my misplaced faith in the people I loved. When I finally left the restaurant, I drove home in a daze. The apartment that had felt like a sanctuary that morning now felt cold and empty. I changed into comfortable clothes and sat on my couch, staring at my phone and trying to make sense of what had happened. These weren't people who would normally treat me with such casual cruelty. Maya and I had been each other's closest confidants our entire lives. Jessica had been my roommate for 3 years and the maid of honor at what I thought would eventually be my wedding. Amanda and I had supported each other through career changes and relationship struggles. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I replayed recent conversations and interactions, looking for signs that I had somehow offended or hurt someone without realizing it. Had I been too focused on work? Too self-absorbed? Had I missed important events in their lives while planning my own birthday celebration? The self-doubt was crushing, and I spent most of the night analyzing every detail of my recent relationships with these people. The next morning brought a revelation that would shatter whatever remained of my trust in these people. I was checking my email over coffee when I noticed several notifications from my credit card companies. Routine security alerts, I assumed, until I opened them and saw transactions I hadn't made. Large transactions, expensive restaurant charges, designer boutique purchases, and what appeared to be party supply expenditures, all made the previous evening while I was sitting alone at Luminous. My hands shook as I logged into my online banking accounts. The evidence was right there in black and white. While I was eating alone on my birthday, the people I trusted most were using my credit cards to fund their own celebration. The charges told a story that made my stomach turn. Dinner at Celeste, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, for a party of 12. Flowers from an upscale florist. Wine and champagne purchases that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Even a charge from a jewelry store that specialized in engagement rings. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Maya's "something came up" wasn't a last-minute emergency. It was a party. A party they had planned while convincing me they would be at my birthday dinner. A party they funded with my money while I sat alone with a cake meant for 20 people. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial. They hadn't just abandoned me on my birthday. They had actively stolen from me to celebrate something else. I spent the next hour documenting every fraudulent charge, screenshotting the evidence, and cross-referencing the timestamps with the messages I'd received the night before. The timeline was damning. At exactly the time Jessica was texting me about her supposed food poisoning, she was charging a $200 meal to my credit card. While Amanda was claiming a family emergency, she was purchasing what appeared to be engagement party decorations with my money. The most devastating discovery came when I found charges for professional photography services and a cake from the same bakery where I'd purchased my birthday cake. This wasn't just a casual dinner they'd chosen over my birthday. This was a planned celebration, complete with professional documentation and custom desserts. They had put more effort into planning this secret party than I had seen any of them put into anything in years. I called Maya first, my sister who had never lied to me about anything significant in our entire lives. When she answered, her voice had a strained quality that immediately put me on guard. I asked her directly about the charges on my credit card, expecting shock, confusion, or immediate offers to help me figure out what had happened. Instead, there was a long pause, followed by stammering excuses that made no sense. She claimed she had borrowed my card for an emergency but had forgotten to tell me. When I pointed out that the charges were for luxury restaurants and party supplies, she changed her story, saying she had meant to pay me back immediately but hadn't had a chance. When I mentioned the professional photography charge, she hung up on me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My own sister, the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world, hung up rather than explain why she was using my money to fund a secret celebration on my birthday. The conversations with the others followed similar patterns. Jessica claimed she had permission to use my card, though she couldn't explain when or how I had supposedly given it. Amanda insisted it was all a misunderstanding and promised to transfer money to my account immediately, though no transfer ever appeared. David, when I finally reached him, seemed genuinely surprised by my accusations, but couldn't explain why my card information was being used for purchases he was apparently present for, based on the restaurant's online reviews mentioning his name, in connection with the engagement party. By noon, I had a complete picture of what had happened. While I was sitting alone at my birthday dinner, 20 of the most important people in my life were celebrating Maya's surprise engagement to her boyfriend Tom at an elaborate party they had funded entirely with my money. They had used my credit cards, which several of them had access to for legitimate emergencies, to create a celebration that cost more than $3,000. $3,000 spent on a party I wasn't invited to, on my own birthday, while I waited alone for people who never intended to show up. The emotional betrayal was devastating enough, but the financial theft added a layer of violation that made me feel physically sick. These weren't strangers who had somehow gotten hold of my credit card information. These were people I loved, people I trusted with my most personal information, people who knew exactly how much this birthday meant to me because I had talked about it for weeks. They had listened to me plan my celebration while secretly planning their own, knowing they would abandon me to fund their party with my money. I spent the rest of that day in a state of shock, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just a case of friends choosing one event over another. This was a coordinated betrayal that involved financial theft, deliberate deception, and the kind of planning that suggested they had been discussing this behind my back for weeks or even months. Every conversation I'd had with these people in recent weeks took on new meaning as I realized they had been lying to my face while plotting to humiliate and rob me. The worst part was the realization that this level of coordination meant they all knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a series of unfortunate coincidences. 20 people had collectively decided that my birthday was less important than Maya's engagement. And rather than having an honest conversation about scheduling conflicts, they had chosen to lie, steal, and leave me alone with no explanation. The cruelty was breathtaking in its completeness. As evening approached, I found myself back in my apartment, staring at the untouched birthday cake I had brought home from the restaurant. The sugar flowers looked wilted now, and the whole thing seemed like a monument to my own naivety. I had trusted these people completely, had given them access to my financial accounts for emergencies, had prioritized their needs and feelings for years. In return, they had stolen from me and abandoned me on one of the most important days of the year for me. I knew I had to make a decision about how to respond. I could confront them directly, demanding explanations and apologies. I could try to salvage these relationships by treating this as a misunderstanding that could be resolved with honest conversation. I could absorb the financial loss and the emotional pain, chalk it up to learning who people really were, and move on with my life. Or I could take action that would have consequences for all of them. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the money, or even about my ruined birthday. This was about a pattern of behavior that I was only now beginning to recognize. How many times had these people taken advantage of my generosity? How many times had they made decisions that benefited them at my expense, counting on my tendency to avoid confrontation? How many times had I ignored red flags because I wanted to believe that the people I loved would never deliberately hurt me? I remembered Maya borrowing money for rent last year and taking months to pay me back, only doing so after I finally asked directly. I thought about Jessica using my car regularly but never offering to help with gas or maintenance costs. I recalled Amanda asking me to cover her portion of group dinners repeatedly, always promising to pay me back, but rarely following through without reminders. David had stayed in my guest room for 2 weeks last summer while apartment hunting, during which time my utility bills doubled and my grocery expenses tripled, though he never offered to contribute to either. These weren't isolated incidents of people taking advantage of my generosity. They were part of a pattern where I consistently gave more than I received, where my needs were considered less important than everyone else's convenience, where my kindness was seen as weakness rather than love. The birthday betrayal wasn't an aberration. It was the culmination of years of smaller betrayals that I had overlooked because I wanted to believe the best of people I cared about. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant I wasn't crazy for feeling hurt and angry about what had happened. Terrifying because it meant that my entire social circle, including my own sister, saw me as someone whose feelings and financial resources were available for their use without consideration or consent. I wasn't a beloved friend and sister. I was a convenient resource to be exploited when needed and ignored when not. As I sat in my apartment that second night, surrounded by the remnants of a birthday celebration that never happened, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to absorb this betrayal quietly. I wasn't going to pretend it was a misunderstanding or that their excuses were acceptable. I wasn't going to continue being the person everyone turned to for help while receiving nothing but exploitation in return. I was going to report every single fraudulent charge as theft. I was going to let the consequences fall where they might. I was going to stop protecting people who had no interest in protecting me. And I was going to discover exactly how deep this betrayal went, because something told me that what I had uncovered so far was only the beginning of a much larger pattern of deception and exploitation. The decision felt both terrifying and empowering. For the first time in years, I was going to prioritize my own well-being over everyone else's comfort. I was going to find out what happened when the person everyone took for granted finally stopped accepting unacceptable behavior. I was going to learn who these people really were when they faced consequences for their actions. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to document everything, gather evidence, and prepare for the reality that taking action would probably mean losing these relationships entirely. The question was whether relationships built on exploitation and deception were worth preserving in the first place. And as I looked around my empty apartment, still decorated with birthday streamers I had hung that morning in anticipation of a celebration that never came, I realized the answer was becoming clearer by the hour. The morning I called my bank to report the fraudulent charges, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. As I sat on hold, waiting to speak with a fraud specialist, I was scrolling through my banking app when I noticed an account I had completely forgotten about. It was a business account that had been automatically opened when I started my consulting firm 3 years ago, but I had never used it because I preferred keeping my business and personal finances separate. What caught my attention wasn't the account itself, but the balance: $2.7 million. I stared at the number, convinced it was an error. I had never transferred money into this account, had never even accessed it since the initial setup. Yet there it was, showing a series of automatic deposits that had been accumulating for years without my knowledge. When the fraud specialist finally came on the line, I was so distracted by this discovery that I almost forgot why I had called. Her name was Patricia, and she had the kind of efficient, no-nonsense voice that immediately inspired confidence. I explained the situation with my credit cards, providing her with the transaction details and timestamps. Her response was not what I expected. Patricia told me that someone had indeed been using my cards, but the situation was more complex than simple theft. According to their security system, the cards had been used with what appeared to be authorized access, meaning whoever was using them had my actual card numbers, security codes, and even my PIN for some transactions. This suggested that the theft wasn't random. It was being perpetrated by someone who had intimate access to my financial information. More importantly, Patricia informed me that this wasn't the first time. Over the past 2 years, there had been numerous charges that their fraud detection system had flagged as potentially suspicious. But since the amounts were relatively small and the purchases appeared to be made by someone with authorized access, they had never contacted me. The birthday incident was simply the largest and most obvious example of a pattern that had been developing for years. As Patricia read through the list of suspicious transactions, I felt my world tilting on its axis. Restaurant charges, shopping trips, gas purchases, even rent payments had been made with my cards by people I trusted. The amounts were usually small enough that I hadn't noticed them among my regular expenses, but when added together, they totaled nearly $15,000 over 2 years. $15,000 that my supposed friends and family had slowly stolen from me while I remained completely unaware. But the real shock came when Patricia accessed my business account to cross-reference the suspicious activities. The money in that account wasn't an error or a banking mistake. It was mine, legally and completely. When I had established my consulting firm, I had apparently signed documents that I hadn't fully understood, creating automatic investment transfers that had been building wealth in my name for years. The consulting work I had been doing on weekends and evenings, which I had thought was just extra income, had actually been generating substantial profits that were automatically invested in a diversified portfolio. Patricia explained that many small business owners are unaware of the full financial structures their accountants create for them. In my case, my accountant had set up a system where a percentage of my consulting income was automatically invested, and those investments had performed extraordinarily well. The $2.7 million was the result of 3 years of consistent, aggressive investing, combined with a bull market that had multiplied my returns far beyond what anyone could have predicted. I was rich. Not just comfortable or financially stable, but genuinely wealthy. And somehow, I had been living like a middle-class person while my business account accumulated millions, because I had never bothered to check an account I thought was empty. The irony was staggering. While people I trusted were stealing hundreds of dollars from my personal accounts, I had been completely unaware that I had access to millions in business assets. After hanging up with Patricia, I immediately called my accountant, Marcus Webb, a man I had met through a professional networking group and trusted to handle my business finances. Marcus had always been somewhat cryptic about my financial situation, giving me quarterly reports that I admittedly never read very carefully. I had assumed that because I wasn't actively managing the business account, there wasn't much happening with it. Marcus seemed surprised when I called asking about the account. Balance. His voice had an odd quality when he explained that he had been trying to schedule a meeting with me for months to discuss my financial situation, but I had always been too busy to meet. According to him, my consulting business had become far more successful than either of us had anticipated, and my investment portfolio had grown to the point where I needed to start making some serious decisions about asset management and tax planning. He told me something that made my head spin. The consulting work I thought was a side hustle was actually generating more income than my day job. The clients I worked with on weekends valued my marketing expertise so highly that they were paying premium rates for my services. Several of them had been asking if I would consider taking on larger projects or even leaving my corporate job to work with them full-time. Marcus had been fielding these inquiries for months, trying to coordinate meetings between me and potential clients who wanted to offer me substantial contracts. The realization hit me like a physical blow. While I had been worrying about my career prospects and feeling grateful for my stable corporate job, I had actually built a consulting business that could support me at a level far beyond anything I had ever imagined. While my friends and family saw me as someone to be taken advantage of financially, I had unknowingly become wealthier than any of them could comprehend. Marcus scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon, and when I arrived at his office, he had prepared a presentation that detailed exactly how successful my business had become. The consulting firm I had started almost as an afterthought had attracted high-profile clients who were paying rates I hadn't even known were possible in my industry. My weekend work was generating six-figure annual income, and the investment strategy Marcus had implemented was turning that income into generational wealth. But the most shocking revelation came when Marcus showed me a list of potential clients who had been trying to hire me. These weren't small businesses looking for basic marketing help. These were Fortune 500 companies, major nonprofits, and government agencies that wanted to pay me consultant fees that would dwarf my current corporate salary. Marcus had been trying to tell me for months that I could leave my day job and become financially independent, but I had been too distracted by what I thought were my real responsibilities to pay attention. As I sat in Marcus's office, reviewing contracts and investment statements that painted a picture of wealth I had never imagined, my phone began buzzing with calls and texts from the people who had stolen from me. Maya was calling repeatedly, her messages becoming increasingly frantic as she begged me to call her back. Jessica had sent a long email explaining that there had been a misunderstanding about the credit card charges. Amanda was offering to meet me for coffee to clear the air about what she claimed was a simple miscommunication. I ignored them all. For the first time in my adult life, I had information that gave me actual power in these relationships, and I wasn't going to waste it on explanations or confrontations that would only result in more manipulation. Instead, I asked Marcus to help me understand exactly what my options were, both financially and legally. Marcus introduced me to his business partner, a woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who specialized in helping successful women navigate sudden wealth and the relationship challenges that came with it. Elena had a PhD in psychology and an MBA, and she had built her practice around the specific problems faced by women who discovered they had more financial power than they realized. Elena's first question surprised me. Had I always been someone who avoided attention and downplayed my achievements? When I admitted that I had, she nodded knowingly and explained that many of her clients shared this trait. According to her, women who are naturally successful often unconsciously minimize their accomplishments to avoid threatening other people, especially friends and family members who might feel insecure about their own achievements. She suggested that my unawareness of my own wealth wasn't accidental. On some level, I had avoided paying attention to my business success because I intuitively understood that knowledge would change my relationships with everyone around me. By staying focused on my day job and treating my consulting work as a hobby, I had been able to maintain the illusion that I was just like everyone else in my social circle. But Elena also warned me that the people who had been taking advantage of me would not react well to learning about my actual financial situation. In her experience, individuals who exploit others financially often become more aggressive when they realize their victim has the resources to fight back. She recommended that I document everything carefully and prepare for the possibility that some of these relationships might become hostile when the truth came out. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop hiding from my own success. I was going to acknowledge my wealth, embrace my achievements, and stop apologizing for being more successful than people who had been treating me poorly. More importantly, I was going to use my resources to ensure that the people who had stolen from me faced appropriate consequences. I started by calling Patricia back and authorizing a full investigation into every suspicious transaction over the past 3 years. With my newfound understanding of my financial situation, I could afford to hire the best legal representation available. I wasn't going to settle for simple repayment of stolen funds. I was going to pursue criminal charges against everyone who had used my accounts without permission. Next, I contacted a law firm that specialized in financial crimes. The lawyer I spoke with, Catherine Morgan, was fascinated by my case. According to her, The systematic nature of the theft, combined with the intimate access the perpetrators had to my financial information, suggested a level of premeditation that would make prosecution relatively straightforward. More importantly, the amounts involved meant that several of the individuals could face felony charges rather than simple misdemeanor theft. Catherine explained that my case was unusual because most financial exploitation occurs between strangers or casual acquaintances. The fact that my own sister and closest friends were involved made the case more complex emotionally, but actually stronger legally. Betrayal of trust is considered an aggravating factor in financial crimes, and the prosecution would likely seek enhanced penalties because of the personal relationships involved. But Catherine also warned me that pursuing criminal charges would likely destroy these relationships permanently. There would be no possibility of reconciliation or forgiveness once the legal process began. She needed me to be absolutely certain that I was prepared for the consequences of taking formal action against people I had once considered family. I thought about that question as I sat in my apartment that night, looking at the remnants of my failed birthday celebration. Was I prepared to lose these relationships permanently? The answer came to me with surprising clarity. I had already lost them. The people I thought I knew, the relationships I thought I valued, had never actually existed. I had been in love with illusions, with the people I wanted them to be rather than the people they actually were. The next morning, I called Catherine and told her to proceed with criminal charges against everyone who had used my accounts without permission. I also authorized her to investigate whether there were additional crimes I wasn't aware of, financial or otherwise. If these people had been comfortable stealing from me for years, there was no telling what else they might have been doing. Within hours of that decision, my phone exploded with calls and messages from everyone involved. Somehow, word had gotten out that I was taking legal action, and the panic in their voices was obvious. Maya called crying, begging me to reconsider, and claiming that she had always planned to pay me back. Jessica showed up at my apartment building, demanding that I speak with her and threatening to tell everyone we knew that I was being unreasonable and vindictive. Amanda sent me a long email detailing her financial struggles and explaining that she had only used my card because she was desperate. David called from his car, apparently driving to my apartment while trying to convince me that this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved without involving lawyers. The desperation in all of their communications was telling. They had never expected me to fight back. But the most revealing response came from Tom, Maya's fiancé, whose engagement party had been funded with my stolen money. He sent me a text message that was breathtaking in its audacity. He told me that I was being selfish and petty, that families should support each other during important life events, and that I should be happy for Maya instead of making her engagement. About my hurt feelings. His message made me realize something important. These people genuinely believed they were entitled to my money. They didn't see their actions as theft. They saw them as borrowing from someone who could afford it. In their minds, my financial stability made me responsible for supporting their lifestyle choices, regardless of whether I had consented to do so. They had convinced themselves that taking my money without permission was acceptable because they had decided I didn't need it as much as they did. The entitlement was staggering, but it also confirmed that I was making the right decision. These weren't people who had made mistakes or poor choices in desperate moments. These were people who felt fundamentally entitled to my resources and who became angry when I refused to continue providing them. They had never seen me as an equal deserving of respect and consideration. They had seen me as a resource to be managed and exploited. When Catherine called me with an update on the Chibai investigation, she had news that exceeded even my worst expectations. The financial theft was more extensive than we had initially realized, involving not just credit card fraud, but also identity theft and potentially tax fraud. Several of the individuals had been using my name and credit information for transactions that went far beyond simple purchases. More disturbing was her discovery that some of them had been discussing my financial situation with each other for months. sharing information about my income, my spending habits, and my apparent lack of attention to my accounts. Catherine had obtained text message records that showed they viewed me as an easy target who could be taken advantage of indefinitely because I was too trusting and too conflict-averse to fight back. The investigation had also revealed that the birthday incident wasn't spontaneous. Maya's engagement party had been planned for weeks, and the decision to fund it with my money while abandoning my birthday celebration had been discussed and agreed upon by multiple people in advance. They had collectively decided that Maya's engagement was more important than my birthday, and rather than having an honest conversation about scheduling conflicts, they had chosen to lie, steal, and humiliate me. But Catherine's most significant discovery was that this pattern of exploitation extended beyond just financial theft. She had found evidence that several of these individuals had been using my professional reputation and connections for their own benefit, presenting themselves as associated with my consulting business when pursuing their own career opportunities. They had been leveraging my success while simultaneously stealing from me, using every aspect of my life that they could access for their own advancement. As I absorbed this information, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The magnitude of the betrayal was so complete that it removed any doubt about whether I was doing the right thing. These people had treated every aspect of my life as available for their exploitation. They had stolen my money, my professional reputation, my trust, and my emotional energy. The only thing they hadn't managed to steal was my actual success, because I had been too oblivious to realize how successful I had become. Now I knew exactly who I was dealing with, and more importantly, I knew exactly what resources I had available to respond. I wasn't the vulnerable, naive victim they had been exploiting for years. I was a successful businesswoman with substantial financial resources and access to the best legal representation available. And I was no longer interested in protecting people who had never shown any interest in protecting me. The real confrontation was about to begin, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I held all the cards. The private investigator Catherine recommended was a woman named Victoria Nash, and when she walked into my apartment carrying 3 thick folders, I knew my world was about to shift again. Victoria had spent 20 years working corporate fraud cases, and she had the kind of methodical approach that left no stone unturned. What she had discovered about my situation went far beyond simple credit card theft. Victoria opened the first folder and spread out what looked like a family tree. But instead of showing biological relationships, it mapped financial connections between everyone who had betrayed me. The diagram was complex and disturbing, showing patterns of shared expenses, coordinated purchases, and financial interdependencies that I had never suspected. According to Victoria's research, these people hadn't just been stealing from me individually. They had been operating as a coordinated network for years. Maya and Jessica shared a joint savings account that I had never known about. Amanda and David had been living together in an apartment that was significantly more expensive than either of their individual incomes could support. Tom, Maya's fiancé, had been unemployed for 8 months while maintaining a lifestyle that should have been impossible without substantial hidden income. All of them had been using my money not just for individual purchases, but to fund a collective standard of living that was completely beyond their legitimate means. Victoria explained that this type of coordinated financial exploitation was more common than most people realized, especially when the victim was someone who avoided conflict and had a history of generosity. The group dynamic actually made the theft more sustainable because no single individual felt responsible for the overall harm they were causing. Each person could rationalize their own actions as minor, while participating in a larger scheme that was systematically draining my resources. But the financial theft was only the beginning of what Victoria had uncovered. Her investigation had revealed that these people had been actively sabotaging my personal relationships and professional opportunities while stealing from me. The pattern was sophisticated and deliberate, designed to keep me isolated and dependent on their friendship while making me more vulnerable to continued exploitation. Victoria showed me evidence that Maya had been intercepting my mail for months, including invitations to professional networking events and social gatherings that I had never received. She had been presenting herself as my representative in situations where organizers expected me to attend, using my reputation to gain access to events and opportunities that were meant for me. In some cases, she had actually attended events in my place, introducing herself as my business partner and collecting contacts that should have been mine. The mail interception explained so many things that had confused me over the past year. I had wondered why I seemed to be losing touch with colleagues and acquaintances, why invitations to important industry events had stopped coming, why people I had worked with professionally seemed distant when I encountered them socially. Maya had been systematically cutting me off from my professional network while building her own career on connections that belonged to me. Jessica's role in the conspiracy was even more disturbing. She had been monitoring my online activities, including my email and social media accounts, using passwords I had shared with her during our roommate days. Victoria had discovered that Jessica had been reading my private communications for years, gathering information about my work projects, my client relationships, and my personal life that she then shared with the others in the group. This surveillance explained how they had been able to coordinate their theft so effectively. Jessica always seemed to know when I had received payments from clients, when I was planning to make large purchases, and when I would be distracted by work deadlines. She had been using her access to my private information to help the group time their fraudulent activities for maximum impact and minimum detection. Amanda's contribution to the scheme was perhaps the most psychologically manipulative. She had been deliberately creating emotional crises that required my financial support, manufacturing emergencies that didn't exist to justify her requests for money. Victoria had documentation showing that many of Amanda's supposed financial hardships were fabricated, designed to trigger my protective instincts and make me feel guilty for having more resources than she did. The fake emergencies weren't random. They were carefully timed to coincide with periods when I was earning significant income from my consulting work. Amanda would create a crisis just after I had received a large payment, ensuring that I would have the cash available to help her while my guard was down due to my own financial success. She had been manipulating my emotions to steal from me for years, using my empathy and desire to help as weapons against me. David's role was more subtle but equally calculated. He had been serving as the group's intelligence gatherer, using his position as my cousin to access family information that the others couldn't obtain directly. Victoria had discovered that David had been reporting on my activities to the others, including details about my work schedule, my travel plans, and my social commitments that allowed them to coordinate their activities around my availability. But the most shocking discovery in Victoria's investigation was that this conspiracy extended beyond the people I had already identified. The network included several individuals I had considered peripheral friends or acquaintances, people who had been playing supporting roles in the scheme without my knowledge. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had been accepting packages addressed to me and turning them over to Maya instead of delivering them directly. My hairdresser had been sharing information about my conversations during appointments with Jessica, who was also a client. Even my mother had been inadvertently involved in the scheme. Victoria's investigation revealed that Maya had been monitoring our mother's phone calls with me, gathering information about my emotional state and my financial decisions that she then used to plan the group's activities. Maya had convinced our mother that she was helping to coordinate family support for me during stressful periods, when in reality she was using that information to identify opportunities for theft. The psychological sophistication of the operation was breathtaking. These people had created a comprehensive system for monitoring, manipulating, and exploiting me that touched every aspect of my life. They had turned my own generosity, empathy, and trust into tools for their financial gain, while systematically isolating me from potential sources of support or alternative perspectives that might have helped me recognize what was happening. Victoria's second folder contained evidence of how the group had been coordinating their activities through encrypted messaging apps and secret social media groups. The conversations she had obtained through legal channels were chilling in their casual cruelty and calculated planning. They discussed my emotional state like stock market analysts reviewing an investment opportunity, sharing strategies for maximizing their returns while minimizing their risk of detection. One conversation thread, dated 6 months before my birthday, showed them planning Maya's engagement party with full knowledge that it would conflict with my birthday celebration. They had discussed various options for handling the scheduling conflict, including telling me the truth and asking me to reschedule my party. But they had ultimately decided that stealing my money to fund their event while leaving me alone on my birthday would be more convenient and profitable than having an honest conversation about competing priorities. The casual nature of their planning was perhaps the most hurtful aspect of the entire betrayal. They discussed destroying my birthday as if it were a minor inconvenience, something to be managed rather than a significant emotional event in the life of someone they claimed to love. They had weighed my feelings against their desire for an expensive party and decided that my emotional well-being was worth less than their convenience. But the conversations also revealed something else. They were afraid of me. Despite their exploitation and manipulation, they genuinely believed that I was more capable and successful than they were. Their discussions were filled with resentment about my professional achievements, my financial stability, and what they perceived as my effortless success in areas where they struggled. The theft wasn't just about money. It was about trying to level a playing field that they felt was unfairly tilted in my favor. This resentment explained the psychological cruelty of their actions. They weren't just stealing from me, they were trying to humiliate and diminish me. The birthday abandonment was designed to make me feel worthless and alone, to convince me that my success meant nothing if the people I loved didn't value me. They had weaponized my own insecurities against me, using my fear of abandonment to make me more compliant and less likely to question their behavior. Victoria's third folder contained the most disturbing revelations of all. Her investigation had uncovered evidence that this group had been researching other potential victims, studying my professional network and personal relationships to identify other people they might be able to exploit using similar methods. They had created detailed profiles of my colleagues, clients, and acquaintances, analyzing their financial situations and psychological vulnerabilities with the same methodical approach they had used against me. The profiles were comprehensive and chilling. They had identified several of my female colleagues as potential targets, focusing on women who shared characteristics with me: successful, generous, conflict-averse, and isolated from strong family support systems. They had been planning to use their connections to me as a way to gain access to these women, positioning themselves as trustworthy friends who could be introduced through my network. Maya had already begun implementing this strategy with one of my clients, a successful architect named Dr. Rebecca Torres, who had hired me for a major marketing project. Maya had attended a networking event as my representative and had connected with Rebecca, presenting herself as my business partner and arranging follow-up meetings to discuss potential collaborations. Victoria's investigation revealed that Maya was planning to use this relationship to gain access to Rebecca's financial information and personal life, just as she had done with me. The realization that they were planning to victimize other people using my reputation and connections was devastating. I had unknowingly become a tool in their scheme to exploit other successful women. My professional credibility was being used as bait to lure potential victims into relationships with people who intended to steal from them. Every introduction I made, every professional relationship I shared, was potentially putting other people at risk. Victoria explained that this expansion of their criminal activities actually worked in our favor legally. The evidence of planning and premeditation, combined with their attempts to involve multiple victims, elevated their crimes from simple theft to organized fraud conspiracy. The legal penalties they faced would be much more severe than if they had simply stolen money from me impulsively or individually. But Victoria also warned me that the expansion of their activities meant they had more to lose if their scheme was exposed. People who had been planning crimes on this scale were likely to become desperate when faced with criminal charges, and desperate people often made dangerous decisions. She recommended that I take additional security precautions and avoid any direct contact with the conspirators until the legal process was complete. That recommendation proved prescient when, later that day, Maya showed up at my workplace. I was in the middle of a client meeting when my assistant knocked on my door to tell me that my sister was in the lobby, demanding to speak with me immediately. When I declined to see her, Maya began creating a scene, crying loudly and claiming that I was destroying our family over a misunderstanding. The disruption was embarrassing and unprofessional, exactly the kind of situation that could damage my reputation with clients and colleagues. But as I watched Maya's performance through my office window, I realized something important. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a calculated attempt to damage my professional credibility and force me into a public confrontation where she could manipulate the narrative in her favor. Maya knew that I valued my professional reputation and would be uncomfortable with any situation that made me look unstable or unreliable to my colleagues. By creating a scene at my workplace, she was trying to pressure me into meeting with her privately to make the disruption stop. She was counting on my desire to avoid conflict and protect my professional image to override my decision to avoid contact with her. But I had learned too much about manipulation tactics to fall for this strategy. Instead of rushing down to defuse the situation, I called building security and had Maya removed from the premises. I then sent an email to my colleagues explaining that I was dealing with a family member who was upset about a legal matter, and that I apologized for any disruption to their workday. The response from my colleagues was overwhelmingly supportive, with several people sharing their own stories of difficult family situations. Maya's failed attempt to manipulate me at work was followed by similar efforts from the other conspirators. Jessica began calling my clients directly, claiming to be my business partner and suggesting that there were problems with my mental health that they should be aware of. Amanda started a rumor among our mutual acquaintances that I had become paranoid and vindictive, claiming that I was falsely accusing innocent people of theft because I couldn't accept that they had grown apart from me naturally. David took a different approach, contacting our extended family members to convince them that I was having a nervous breakdown and needed intervention. He told our aunts and uncles that I was making wild accusations against Maya and destroying family relationships over minor financial disagreements. Several family members called me expressing concern about my mental state and urging me to seek professional help for what they had been told was a psychological crisis. The coordinated nature of these attacks confirmed everything Victoria had discovered about their systematic approach to manipulation. They weren't just defending themselves against criminal charges. They were trying to destroy my credibility and isolate me from potential sources of support. They understood that their best chance of avoiding consequences was to convince everyone who knew me that I was unstable and unreliable. But their strategy backfired in ways they hadn't anticipated. The people who knew me professionally were impressed by how calmly and professionally I handled the disruptions they created. My clients appreciated my transparency about the situation and my commitment to protecting our working relationships from my personal problems. Several colleagues reached out to offer support and shared their own experiences with difficult family situations. More importantly, their attempts to discredit me provided additional evidence for the criminal case against them. Catherine was able to use their harassment and defamation efforts to demonstrate the ongoing nature of their criminal conspiracy and their willingness to escalate their harmful behavior when faced with consequences. The legal penalties they faced increased substantially when their post-discovery actions were added to the charges against them. Victoria's investigation also revealed connections between my situation and similar cases in other cities. The methods these people had used were not original. They were part of a larger pattern of exploitation that had been used against other successful women across the country. Victoria had identified at least 6 other cases involving similar coordinated financial theft and psychological manipulation, all targeting women who shared certain professional and personal characteristics. This discovery led to contact with other victims who had experienced similar betrayals. Speaking with these women was both heartbreaking and empowering. Their stories were variations on the same theme. Successful, generous women who had been systematically exploited by people they trusted, using methods that were sophisticated enough to avoid detection for years. But all of them had eventually fought back and won, both legally and personally. One woman, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, had discovered that her entire social circle had been stealing from her for 5 years, using her medical practice's resources to fund their lifestyles while convincing her that she was imagining the financial discrepancies. Another, Maria Santos, had learned that her business partner had been embezzling from their successful restaurant while poisoning her relationships with suppliers and employees. Each story was unique, but the patterns were remarkably similar. These conversations helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't personal failure or bad luck. It was a recognizable form of abuse that targeted specific types of people, using proven methods. The shame and self-doubt I had been feeling were part of the intended effect. The perpetrators relied on their victims blaming themselves rather than recognizing the systematic nature of the exploitation. More importantly, all of these women had not only recovered from their experiences, but had become stronger and more successful afterward. They had learned to trust their instincts, set appropriate boundaries, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. Their stories gave me hope that my current nightmare would eventually lead to a better, more authentic life. As Victoria's investigation continued, she uncovered evidence that the conspiracy against me had been more extensive and damaging than we initially realized. But she also provided me with the tools and knowledge I needed to dismantle their network completely. The criminal charges were just the beginning. We were building a case that would expose every aspect of their operation and ensure that they faced consequences for every crime they had committed. The psychological warfare they were waging against me was intensive and sophisticated, but it was also desperate. They knew that their carefully constructed scheme was collapsing, and their attempts to save themselves were only providing more evidence of their guilt. Every lie they told, every manipulation they attempted, every effort to discredit or intimidate me was being documented and added to the legal case against them. I was no longer the vulnerable, isolated victim they had been exploiting for years. I was a woman with substantial resources, excellent legal representation, and a clear understanding of exactly who I was dealing with. The balance of power had shifted completely, and they were finally going to face consequences for every cruel and criminal thing they had done. But even as I felt more confident about the legal case, I knew the real confrontation was still ahead. These people had built their entire social and financial structure around exploiting me, and they weren't going to surrender that lifestyle without a fight. The evidence Victoria had gathered suggested they were planning something more dramatic than harassment and defamation, something that would force a final showdown between us. I was ready for whatever they had planned, but I also knew that the next phase of this battle would test everything I had learned about standing up for myself and protecting my own interests. The scared, naive woman they had victimized for years was gone forever, but the strong, confident woman I was becoming had never faced a challenge like the one that was coming. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the preliminary hearing, but I barely noticed the crowd. I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, wearing the navy blue suit that had become my armor over the past 6 months. Across the aisle, Maya sat with her lawyer, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. She kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between desperation and calculation. Catherine had prepared me for this moment, explaining that preliminary hearings were typically routine proceedings, where the judge would simply determine whether there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. But nothing about my case had been routine, and she suspected that the defense attorneys would attempt some kind of dramatic gesture to influence public opinion before the trial began. She was right. When Maya's lawyer, a slick-looking man named Robert Kellerman, stood to address the judge, He immediately began painting a picture of family dysfunction and mental illness that had nothing to do with the charges his client faced. According to Kellerman, I was a successful but isolated woman who had become paranoid and vindictive after years of prioritizing career over family relationships. Kellerman claimed that Maya and the others had simply been helping me manage my finances during periods when I was too overwhelmed with work to pay attention to my accounts. He suggested that their use of my credit cards had been authorized, even if that authorization hadn't been formalized in writing. Most audaciously, he argued that my decision to press charges was evidence of a psychological breakdown triggered by the natural evolution of my relationships as my friends and family developed their own independent lives. The performance was masterful in its manipulation of common stereotypes about successful women. Kellerman was essentially arguing that my achievements were evidence of emotional dysfunction, that my independence was proof of social failure, and that my decision to protect myself legally demonstrated mental instability. He was trying to use society's discomfort with powerful women as a weapon against me in court. But Catherine had anticipated this strategy, and her response was devastating. She stood and calmly presented a timeline of theft that spanned 3 years, supported by bank records, surveillance footage, and digital communications that the defense couldn't dispute. She showed the judge evidence of coordination and planning that made it impossible to characterize the thefts as misunderstandings or authorized transactions. More importantly, Catherine introduced evidence that I had never shared with anyone. Recordings I had made of conversations with each of the conspirators after discovering their theft. I had followed Victoria's advice and documented every attempt they made to contact me, every excuse they offered, and every threat they made when their excuses failed to work. The recordings were damning. Maya's voice, pleading with me to drop the charges because prosecution would ruin her life, followed immediately by threats about what she would tell our mother if I continued to persecute her. Jessica's increasingly frantic voicemails, alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations that I was being vindictive and cruel. Amanda's cold calculation as she offered to settle this privately for an amount that was a fraction of what she had stolen. But the most powerful evidence was a recorded phone call with David, who had apparently believed he could intimidate me into withdrawing the charges. In the recording, his voice was clear and unambiguous as he threatened to make things very difficult for me professionally if I didn't come to my senses and remember what family means. He had explicitly threatened retaliation, confirming that the harassment I had experienced wasn't emotional desperation but calculated intimidation. The judge listened to the recordings with an expression of growing disgust. When Catherine finished her presentation, he immediately ruled that there was overwhelming evidence to proceed to trial on all charges, including the additional charges of witness intimidation and conspiracy that had been added based on their post-discovery behavior. He also granted Catherine's request for restraining orders that would prevent any of the defendants from contacting me or approaching my workplace. But the real shock came when the judge addressed Maya directly. He told her that he had rarely seen a case involving such a calculated betrayal of family trust, and that her behavior since the charges were filed suggested she represented a continuing threat to the victim. He was setting bail at amounts that would be difficult for any of them to meet, ensuring they would remain in custody until trial unless they could provide substantial collateral. Maya's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of showing remorse or accepting responsibility, she turned to look directly at me and hissed, "You're going to regret this, Sarah. You have no idea what you've done." Her lawyer immediately tried to quiet her, but the damage was done. She had just made a public threat against a victim in open court, in front of a judge who was already unsympathetic to her case. The judge's response was swift and decisive. He revoked Maya's bail entirely, ordering her held without bond until trial due to her demonstrated willingness to threaten the victim even in court. The other defendants watched in horror as Maya was led away in handcuffs, finally understanding that their situation was far more serious than they had believed. But Maya's removal from the courtroom didn't end the drama. As the hearing concluded, and I was preparing to leave with Catherine, Jessica's mother approached me in the hallway. Mrs. Patterson was a woman I had known for years, someone who had always been kind to me, and whom I had considered almost a second mother. I expected her to be angry or defensive about her daughter's situation. Instead, she took my hands and looked me directly in the eyes with an expression of profound sadness. She told me that she had suspected for months that Jessica was involved in something dishonest, but she had never imagined the scope of what her daughter had done. She had come to court not to support Jessica, but to apologize to me personally for her daughter's actions, and to tell me something that would change everything I thought I knew about the conspiracy against me. Mrs. Patterson explained that Jessica had been recording our conversations for years, not just monitoring my online activities. She had been wearing a wire during our most intimate moments together, capturing my confessions about work stress, relationship fears, and financial concerns that she then shared with the others. But more disturbing was Mrs. Patterson's revelation that Jessica had been selling this information to people outside our immediate circle. According to Mrs. Patterson, Jessica had discovered that there was a market for detailed personal information about successful women, particularly those who were socially isolated and financially vulnerable. She had been providing profiles of me to professional scammers and con artists, essentially advertising me as a potential victim to criminals who specialized in exploiting women like me. The implication was staggering. The conspiracy I had uncovered wasn't just about my friends and family stealing from me. It was about them essentially pimping me out to other criminals who might want to exploit me. I had been turned into a commodity, with Jessica selling access to my personal information and emotional vulnerabilities to anyone willing to pay for it. Mrs. Patterson had discovered this when she found large cash deposits in Jessica's room that couldn't be explained by the theft from my accounts alone. When she confronted her daughter, Jessica had broken down and confessed to the information selling, though she claimed she had never allowed anyone to actually approach me directly. According to Jessica, she had been planning to stop once she had earned enough money to pay for graduate school. But Mrs. Patterson had continued investigating on her own, and what she found terrified her. Jessica's computer contained correspondence with individuals who weren't interested in simple financial exploitation. These were people who specialized in more serious crimes: identity theft, insurance fraud, and what appeared to be elaborate, long-term cons that could destroy their victims' lives completely. Catherine immediately recognized the significance of this information. The evidence Mrs. Patterson provided transformed my case from a relatively straightforward theft prosecution into something much larger and more serious. If Jessica had been selling my personal information to other criminals, then I was potentially at risk from people I had never met, individuals who had detailed knowledge of my life and finances, and who might view me as an ongoing opportunity for exploitation. More importantly, the information selling elevated the charges against all of the conspirators. They were no longer just thieves. They were part of a criminal enterprise that engaged in human trafficking of a sort, selling access to victims for other criminals to exploit. The legal penalties they faced increased dramatically, with potential federal charges that could result in decades in prison rather than the few years they might have faced for simple theft. But the discovery also meant that my ordeal was far from over. Catherine explained that we would need to investigate how many other criminals had purchased information about me, what they might be planning, and how to protect me from threats I didn't even know existed. The network of people who might want to harm me had potentially expanded far beyond the friends and family members I had already identified. Victoria took on the task of investigating Jessica's criminal contacts, working with federal authorities to identify everyone who had purchased information about me. The investigation was complex and time-consuming, involving cooperation with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. But gradually, a picture emerged of a sophisticated criminal network that specialized in identifying and exploiting successful women. The network was larger and more organized than anyone had initially suspected. It included professional con artists, identity thieves, insurance fraudsters, and even individuals involved in more serious crimes like kidnapping and human trafficking. They had developed a systematic approach to identifying potential victims, purchasing detailed personal information from sources like Jessica, and then executing elaborate schemes designed to separate women from their money, property, and sometimes their freedom. My profile had been circulating in this network for over a year. Multiple criminal organizations had purchased detailed information about my daily routines, my financial holdings, my professional relationships, and my psychological vulnerabilities. Some had already begun preliminary surveillance of me, gathering additional intelligence to supplement what Jessica had provided. Others were in the planning stages of elaborate cons designed specifically to exploit my particular combination of wealth, isolation, and tendency to trust people who presented themselves as needing help. The realization that I had been living under surveillance by professional criminals for months was terrifying. But it also explained some things that had puzzled me. The strange phone calls that had increased in frequency over the past year. The unusual interest strangers had shown in my work and personal life. The sense I had sometimes had of being watched or followed. Victoria's investigation revealed that at least 3 separate criminal organizations had been developing plans to exploit me. One group had been planning an elaborate romance scam, intending to have one of their members develop a relationship with me and then gradually gain access to my financial accounts. Another had been researching my business operations, apparently planning to approach me with fake investment opportunities that would allow them to steal my assets legally. Most disturbing was the third group, which had been planning what appeared to be a kidnapping scheme. They had detailed information about my daily routines, my home security system, and my travel patterns. They had identified the best times and locations to approach me, and they had been gathering information about my family relationships to determine how much ransom they might be able to demand. The federal investigation into these threats was ongoing, but Catherine recommended that I take immediate steps to protect myself. She arranged for professional security services to monitor my home and workplace, and she worked with my employer to modify my work schedule and location to make me a more difficult target. For several months, I lived essentially under protection, never knowing whether the next stranger I encountered might be someone who intended to harm me. But the security measures also gave me time to process everything that had happened and to plan for the future I wanted to create. Working with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, I began to understand how my patterns of behavior had made me vulnerable to exploitation, and more importantly, how I could build a life that was both generous and protected. Dr. Rodriguez helped me see that my desire to help people wasn't a weakness that needed to be eliminated. It was a strength that needed to be channeled more wisely. She taught me how to distinguish between people who genuinely needed help and those who were simply looking for someone to exploit. More importantly, she helped me understand that protecting myself from users and manipulators actually made me more capable of helping people who deserved and appreciated support. The criminal trials began 8 months after my birthday disaster, and they were every bit as dramatic as Catherine had predicted. Maya and the others had eventually been released on bail, but the conditions of their release were strict and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Their lawyers had tried various strategies to avoid conviction, but the documented evidence of their crimes was too extensive to dispute. Maya's trial was the most emotionally difficult for me to attend. Watching my sister sit in the defendant's chair, listening to prosecutors detail years of theft and betrayal, was heartbreaking despite everything she had done to me. But it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, Maya was facing consequences for her actions rather than being protected from them by family loyalty and my own reluctance to create conflict. The evidence presented at trial was even more damning than I had expected. Catherine and Victoria had uncovered financial records, communications, and surveillance footage that painted a picture of criminal activity that was both extensive and calculating. The jury heard recordings of the conspirators planning their crimes, saw bank records that documented years of theft, and learned about the broader criminal network that had been targeting me. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Jennifer Martinez and the other women who had experienced similar exploitation. They described the psychological tactics used to manipulate and isolate victims, the ways successful women were specifically targeted for this type of abuse, and the long-term damage caused by systematic betrayal by trusted people. Their testimony helped the jury understand that this wasn't a family dispute or a misunderstanding about money. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used intimate knowledge of victims' psychology and relationships to facilitate theft and exploitation. The women who testified were articulate, successful, and clearly intelligent, making it impossible to dismiss them as naive or gullible victims who had somehow brought their victimization on themselves. The verdicts came after 3 days of deliberation. Maya was convicted on all counts: theft, fraud, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and racketeering. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 8 years. Jessica received 15 years due to her role in selling information to other criminals. Amanda and David received shorter sentences, but still faced several years in prison. Tom, Maya's fiancé, had cooperated with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing testimony about the group's activities that helped convict the others. His cooperation had revealed additional details about their crimes and their connections to the broader criminal network. He received 3 years in prison and was required to make full restitution for his share of the stolen money. The restitution orders were substantial, requiring all of the defendants to repay not just the money they had stolen, but also damages for the emotional distress and security costs their crimes had caused. The amounts were large enough that most of them would be paying me for the rest of their lives, ensuring that the financial consequences of their actions would follow them long after they were released from prison. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, wasn't the most important outcome of my ordeal. The real transformation was personal. I had learned to trust my instincts, set appropriate boundaries, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. I had discovered that I was stronger and more capable than I had ever imagined, and that standing up for myself didn't make me selfish or cruel. More importantly, I had learned to appreciate my own success and to stop apologizing for my achievements. With Marcus's help, I had left my corporate job and built my consulting firm into a thriving business that allowed me to work with clients I genuinely enjoyed while maintaining complete control over my time and resources. The wealth I had been unconsciously accumulating became the foundation for a life that was both financially secure and personally fulfilling. The security threats from the criminal network gradually diminished as federal authorities dismantled the organizations that had been targeting me. Several major arrests were made, and the information Jessica had been selling was used to identify and protect other potential victims. My case became part of a larger federal initiative to combat organized exploitation of successful women, helping to protect others from experiencing what I had endured. I also began working with victim advocacy organizations, sharing my story, and helping other women recognize and escape from exploitative relationships. The combination of my professional background in marketing and my personal experience with sophisticated manipulation made me uniquely qualified to help others understand and respond to similar situations. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding. I met women from all backgrounds who had experienced various forms of systematic exploitation. Doctors whose practices had been infiltrated by thieves, business owners whose partners had been embezzling from them, professionals whose social circles had been systematically robbing them. Each story was unique, but the patterns were remarkably consistent. Working with these women helped me understand that my experience wasn't unusual or shameful. Sophisticated exploitation targeted successful, generous people, specifically because their achievements and kindness made them valuable victims. The criminals who had targeted me were professionals who specialized in identifying and manipulating people like me. Their success didn't reflect any weakness or failure on my part. It reflected their skill at exploiting basic human decency. 2 years after my birthday disaster, I threw myself a party. It was a celebration not just of another year of life, but of the life I had built after learning who I really was and what I was capable of accomplishing. The guest list was carefully curated, including only people who had demonstrated genuine friendship and respect for my boundaries. The party was held at my new home, a beautiful house in a secure neighborhood that reflected both my success and my newfound confidence in enjoying that success openly. The guests included colleagues who had become genuine friends, clients who had become mentors and collaborators, and new relationships built on mutual respect and authentic connection. As I looked around the room at people who genuinely cared about me, who celebrated my achievements rather than resenting them, who contributed to my life rather than draining from it, I realized how much my world had changed. The loneliness and isolation I had felt for years had been replaced by connections that were deeper and more meaningful than anything I had experienced before. The birthday cake was magnificent, a custom creation that cost 5 times what I had, spent on the cake that sat untouched 2 years earlier. But more importantly, it was surrounded by people who were genuinely happy to celebrate with me. People who had chosen to be there because they valued our relationship, not because they wanted something from me. During the party, I received a call from Catherine with news about Maya. She had been offered an opportunity to participate in a prison rehabilitation program that could reduce her sentence if she completed courses in financial responsibility and made consistent progress toward paying her restitution. Maya had asked Catherine to contact me to see if I would be willing to meet with her as part of her rehabilitation process. The request forced me to confront feelings I had been avoiding for 2 years. Despite everything Maya had done to me, she was still my sister. The anger and betrayal I felt toward her hadn't eliminated the love I had felt for most of my life. But I also knew that any relationship we might rebuild would have to be fundamentally different from what we had before. After discussing the situation with Dr. Rodriguez and thinking carefully about my own emotional readiness, I agreed to meet with Maya. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at the prison, with both Catherine and a prison counselor present. Maya looked older and smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in years. The conversation was awkward and painful, but also surprisingly honest. Maya acknowledged the full scope of what she had done to me, without excuses or minimization. She expressed genuine remorse for her actions and accepted full responsibility for the consequences she was facing. Most importantly, she didn't ask me to forgive her or to help her avoid the penalties for her crimes. Instead, she asked me to tell her about the life I had built since her arrest. She wanted to know about my business, my new relationships, and my work with other victims. As I described the positive changes in my life, I saw something in her, expression that I had never seen before, genuine happiness for my success, without resentment or jealousy. By the end of our conversation, I realized that Maya was finally becoming the person I had always hoped she could be. Prison had forced her to confront the destructive patterns that had governed her life for years, and for the first time, she was taking responsibility for changing them rather than expecting other people to accommodate her dysfunction. I left the prison with a sense of closure I hadn't expected to find. Maya and I might never have the close relationship we had once shared, but we could potentially build something new, based on honesty and mutual respect. The sister who had betrayed me was gone, but the woman who was taking her place might be someone worth knowing. The drive home from the prison took me past the restaurant where I had sat alone on my birthday 2 years earlier. I stopped in the parking lot for a moment, remembering the devastation and confusion I had felt that night. The woman who had sat in that private dining room, surrounded by empty chairs and an untouched cake, had been naive and trusting to the point of self-destruction. But she had also been strong enough to fight back when she finally understood what was happening to her. She had been brave enough to face painful truths about people she loved and determined enough to build something better from the ruins of her old life. The person I had become owed everything to the courage that woman had found in her darkest moment. As I drove home to my beautiful house, my successful business, and my carefully chosen circle of genuine friends, I felt grateful for every painful lesson that had brought me to this point. The birthday that had seemed like the worst day of my life had actually been the beginning of the best life I had ever imagined. The people who had tried to destroy me had inadvertently freed me from limitations I hadn't even known existed. Their betrayal had forced me to discover my own strength, to claim my own success, and to build relationships based on my true worth, rather than my willingness to be exploited. I had learned that being alone was infinitely better than being surrounded by people who didn't value me. I had discovered that my achievements were something to celebrate rather than apologize for. Most importantly, I had found out who I really was when I stopped trying to be what other people wanted me to be. The woman who ate alone on her birthday while others used her credit cards had been a victim. The woman who reported those cards as stolen and fought back against every person who had betrayed her was a survivor. The woman who had built a new life, helped other victims, and found genuine happiness was a warrior. And as I pulled into my driveway, I knew that this warrior's story was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.